to AI Home Podcast, the first podcast for real estate resources and independent living strategies for the disability community. Why? Because accessibility is home. Hi, I'm Angela Fox, blogger and author of My Blue Front Door. I am delighted to start off my very first podcast during the historical month of July for our community, people with disabilities. I have created this podcast because of my own struggle in housing. My history began at the end of the U.S. recession when I decided that I wanted to finally transition from apartment living to owning my first home. With the recession, I thought for sure that I would get a killer deal on a house. It would have been a both joyous and also scary situation for anyone buying a home for the first time and during a recession. But for me, it was particularly unique, I should say, because I was a young paraplegic young woman, and I knew that finding a home was going to be requiring some unique skill sets. However, I believed that at that time, because there were hungry realtors wanting employment, and being a new attorney myself, that I would have both the opportunity and the knowledge to be able to find that one particular home that I could make fully accessible to my unique needs. While I did get the job done, the discrimination I faced with realtors, the limited programs on home ownership for people with disabilities, and how do you make a pre-ADA built home accessible, I was not prepared to deal with. And all those things I had to deal with at once, which was also a problem. But I realized after the fact, of course, that under all these things, there was a disconnect between realtors, contractors, and the disability community and their friends. This disconnect causes this single story that people with disabilities are not homeowners, nor could they be homeowners, and if they're not living with the family, then they're probably low-income renters. Hopefully, if you're listening to this podcast, you know that is not true, and that is a stereotype. But it gave me this idea. Do other people know how to do that? Do other people know how to become homeowners? So that's the purpose of this podcast, is to bridge that gap of lack of information between realtors, contractors, and the disability community. I will be interviewing realtors and home improvement contractors who are both disability friendly and, well, those who may have a lot more to learn. I will also provide takeaways for anyone wanting to become that homeowner with a disability, or if you are a homeowner and you become disabled later, how do you modify your house that you have right now? Finally, I will talk about a range of issues about independent living, including reviews of home products that will help you in every day, because we all know that you're living in an inaccessible world. Those product reviews, will be in the second portion called On the Top Shelf. This podcast, for me, will be an evolving process, as I am not an expert, and I believe that I will start out between a 15 to 30-minute podcast on a monthly basis, because I believe that quality is better than quantity. But don't worry, if you want more information between the podcasts, I will be adding articles to my blog, which I will discuss at the end of every podcast. So there you have it, Accessibilityishome, how it came to be. So let's begin in episode 0, and thank you for still being there. So, July 26, 2020 will be the 30th anniversary of the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I was 8 years old when the act was passed, and I remember it. And for many people, like myself, July 26 is considered our Independence Day because it is a law that codified the spirit of several other disability laws into one civil rights legislation. While the first attempt to pass the ADA failed in 1988, the Fair Housing Act amendment did succeed. But why am I bringing up the FAH amendment during the 30th anniversary of the ADA? Well, obviously, besides the focus of this podcast on real estate and independent living topics, the language and how it came to be, the FAH helped the ADA actually get passed. But how? Let's take a look at what FAH is. So the FAH actually was established in 1968, and it actually is called the 1968 Civil Rights Act, and it is considered a sister law to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the term Fair Housing Act is just a nickname to a portion that talks about fair housing in the 1968 Civil Rights Act. I know it might sound baffling because everybody uses Fair Housing Act as if that was the title of the law, but it's not. But for the purpose of this podcast and because everybody else calls it, I'm going to call it the Fair Housing Act. But it's important to be mindful that it's actually called the 1968 Civil Rights Act, and there's a reason behind that. So behind the FAH, it actually prohibits housing discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and national origin. Sex was added in 1974, but it took until 1988, I was 6 years old, 1988, before the term handicap was added to the FAH. While the term handicap by today's standards is certainly dated to say the least, wasn't moved past that, the spirit behind that, adding the word handicap, was revolutionary because it was to prevent discrimination rather than an act that just merely required certain programs or certain benefits be available to the people with disabilities, like the Rehab Act of 1973. Having this legislation be part of the historical civil rights movement, hence calling the 1968 Civil Rights Act, provide the final stepping stone for the disability community to finally be recognized as being a minority that suffers discrimination, not just, not having access, but actual discrimination, be recognized and having a law or amendment that says that. And in this particular case, it was the FAH amendment. And because of having that cemented in the Congress minds at that time in 1988, then 2 years later, when the 88 finally got back up in play, it was able to be passed. It helped Congress really get comfortable with this idea that people with disabilities are not just a minority group, they are a minority group that has suffered a history of discrimination. And that was all based on the stepping stone that the FAH amendment had. But there's another connection between FAH and the 88, not just merely timing, but because of an unsung hero, U.S. Representative Hamilton Fish Jr. The FAH amendment was actually introduced by U.S. Fish, the U.S. Representative Fish, a Republican from New York State at that time. He worked with a lot of other Republicans who actually had more liberal views than what the party was known for, and he was able to successfully get the FAH amendment passed. He then worked with U.S. Representative Kennedy, and between the two, 2 years later, they were able to get the 88 passed. So this idea that there's no real connection between FAH and the ADA is not necessarily true. You just gotta look at the history. But I definitely think it brings a whole new meaning to home is where the heart is. Now, a history lesson, especially during an anniversary event, is great to have. But practically speaking, how does the ADA and the FAH work together at all? What is important for you as a person with a disability to know? Trust me, there's a lot of confusion out there. So the simple explanation is that the FAH is about the process of renting or buying housing, okay? Meaning that the FAH focuses more about the people problem and less about the accessibility of real estate properties. So, for example, preventing people from renting out an apartment or banks discouraging the sale of a house simply because you're disabled, that is a people problem that the Fair Housing Act prohibits. Contrast that with the ADA. The ADA focuses on many things: employment, transportation, technology, and access to public buildings. To the last point, access to public building is the overlap between the ADA and the FAH. So, for example, the leasing office of the apartment complex would be required to be accessible because it's open to the public. This would also apply to any event centers on the residential complex that the public could directly rent out. But when it comes to, let's say, assigned parking spots being wheelchair accessible for an owner of a condo or a pool accessible for residents and their guests, the FAH is the law that could apply. I'd say could apply because one of the surprising takeaways for you that you should be mindful of is that unlike the ADA, any modifications being asked underneath the FAH, it will be at the expense of the owner or the renter. For example, I lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the ground level. I had these two beautiful French doors that opened out, but I didn't have a front patio, and so they had literally put gates in front of the doors, and there was bushes. I thought it was really weird to have, doors that you couldn't open up to anything. But I did ask for my apartment complex if they could remove the gate and remove the bushes and add some extra mulch to level things out because I want to have the availability for a second way out of my apartment in case of a fire. I also have my dog, and it would have been very helpful to let him out in the middle of the night to go pee instead of me having to get dressed and grab the leash and go outside the apartment complex. So I asked for the gate and the bushes and things like that to be removed. I was lucky. They said, no, we're just going to build you a cement ramp. And they could have required me to pay for that ramp, but they didn't. All right? So it's in contrast to the ADA. If my apartment would have been available for the public, obviously it's not, it's my apartment, but if it has, then that ramp should have been automatically been installed. And if somebody from the public says, hey, that apartment is open to the public, it's not accessible, we need to put the ramp, the owners of the resident of the complex will have to put in the ramp, not an individual complaining about it. So that's the difference between the ADA and the FAH. And as you can see, the ADA and the FAH have more than just a spirit of preventing discrimination with each other, but real-world legal requirements. I like to say where one starts, the other begins in the realm of real estate and housing. But stepping back from analyzing the law, because hopefully you're still with me, your eyes are not glazed over, there's another real-world takeaway. It is not surprising to say that when it comes to equal and affordable medical treatment, it's always number one issue for most people with disabilities when they're being surveyed or asked what's going on in their life. As a result of that, the transportation is second. Why? Because you need to get to the hospital. You need to get to those doctor's appointments in order to get the treatment, in order to get the medicine. There's also a similar relationship between employment and housing, or I should say there should be, okay? Generally speaking, when employment comes after the medical bills because, you got to pay for it, but understanding how the ADA preventing employment discrimination and the reasonable accommodation process is important, I will argue that you need to keep in mind having a disability-minded financial plan be part of that. You need to think about these things, including housing, not just about, can I get employment? I know it sounds easier said than done. But why am I talking about that? What's the connection between employment and housing? Well, for one thing, you may say that, when you get employment, a lot of people who do get social services like food stamps and Voucher 8 rental assistance, you might be a little bit concerned about whether or not you're going to lose that if your income's too high, because those programs require low income. So it totally brings this idea of being a homeowner as an impossibility. That basically you either have to choose being in low income to get your benefits or not getting those benefits, and hopefully you can pay for all those other benefits that you normally get and save for housing. That's not necessarily true. Putting that aside for just a moment. And now a quick break from our sponsor. So as you can see and also hearing me, I am sitting on my back deck and I have my grill. I love being out in my back deck. I hate when I forget something and I have to wheel back into the house. particularly my cell phone. However, I'm excited to announce that another disabled-owned business, Cush Pocket, has come up with a solution by creating this fabulous wheelchair bag. I love this bag and have been a proud customer since almost the very beginning. Why do I like it? 1, it's huge. 2, it comes in multiple colors. But 3, you can put it anywhere on the base of your wheelchair. How does that happen? It's attached to the flap and it has little Velcro. You put it directly underneath your cushion of your wheelchair. And the Velcro and the weight of your body ensures that this fabulous Cush Pocket bag, it certainly will not move. I personally have 2 directly in front of me and it hides behind my legs, and I love that because it's so much more convenient. Trust me, you will never forget anything ever again. So as you can see down below, I have a direct link for Cush Pocket, and if you use my code Angela Fox, you will get $1 off. And not only will you get a fabulous bag, but you'll also support 2 disabled-owned businesses, Cush Pocket and my business, Horizontal Houses. Check it out. I would say, though, that the cost of buying a home is only half the expense if you are a person with a disability, like me, who's in a wheelchair, because you need to get that house modified, all right? There are resources for modifications that I discussed in my book, but more resources are available for buying the home itself. Why? Well, many more resources were developed to help future homeowners during the recession, and at the date of this podcast, many still exist, even if they have been forgotten. Of course, those resources, this is when we're going back into, the connection between employment. Of course, those resources require you to be low income based because so many people during the recession were struggling financially, okay? So if you combine all the low income resources out there to purchase a home, you will at least resolve half the problem of home ownership. And let's be honest. If you have been disabled for a while, like I have, you will have likely adjusted to the harsh reality that most housing options, even ones under HUD, are not necessarily fully accessible. They can be, but most are not. Meaning, I'm not just talking about you being able to get a bathroom that's fully wheelchair accessible. You might find that. But do you see a special wall oven with a door opening horizontally rather than vertically to give you the ability to wheel closer to the inside of the oven? I don't think you'll see that. So buying a home that's not accessible may be something that, depending on what it is, you could live for a little while until you save up money. But I know you're probably thinking in the back of your mind, sure, I would love to take in all those opportunities of low-income programs to buy a house and everything like that, but, I still got to pay for the modifications. I still need to have maybe some kind of savings, and if I'm on social security disability, I might lose that. Not anymore. There are other options that are available now in the last few years that there has not been historically. More than ever, there are options to have higher level of income or savings without losing your social benefits. There are 2 options I will discuss later in more detail in later podcasts, but the 2 that come to mind, one is called the ABLE Act account. The ABLE Act account is a federal law that says, hey, you're allowed to save up to $15,000 a year, and it can be rolled over, and the cap in that account is $100,000. So $15,000 a year, cap at $100,000 overall, and you can use that money for anything related to disability. And when I mean disability, I mean it's not just your medical bills or buying medical equipment. It specifically says housing. So you can save up for a down payment. And the beauty of this, the reason why I'm bringing it up, is because if you're on Social Security disability, that money that's in that account will not count against your Social Security disability. And depending on what state you live in, most states have also adopted similar things for the state benefits. So look into that. The other one is a disability trust account. Different states have their own, and that's primarily used for when family wants to establish a trust for money, because when they're gone, they want to make sure that that individual, that family member, has some financial means to be taken care of. Those two options can basically potentially shield you from losing a lot of your benefits. So it's just a matter of planning and looking into those more deeply. And I highly encourage you all to start researching those immediately. But why am I suggesting putting more effort into buying a home rather than acquire higher income? Well, there is that attempt of I could just rent for the rest of my life. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal. I mean, if that's all your comfort level is, by all means, then do that. But stable housing overall will provide you with a better health condition and financial stability compared to most employment options. Putting aside, of course, those who make it big millionaires, and I'm assuming those people are not listening to this podcast. And a prime example, a very, very harsh, who are still living in it, I do apologize. But one that just reared its head up was the COVID crisis, right? The COVID crisis has shown that living in group homes can be a hotspot for any disease to spread. You also have less control over the symptoms you may have, but if you have your own home, one, you're not going to be exposed to all those people. Two, you have more control as to who you let in and what kind of services you can potentially afford to have in. Second is, if you purchase a home with a spare bedroom, it can be rental income for you. I think we tend to kind of don't want to add another layer of responsibility, and by all means, if you don't want to do that, that's totally understandable. But a one-bedroom apartment, as long as you're comfortable with sharing, kitchen and laundry and a few other areas of your house, you can potentially get $600 to $800 a month depending on where you live. So it can be rental income for you that can help pay for the monthly mortgage and prevent a bit of social isolation if you don't have a family, if you're living by yourself like I am. But obviously, if you're married and you have family, that's not the case. The third reason is I really push to have people with disabilities have their own home is that it's easy to successfully paying off your mortgage is a great way to build credit. Unlike other cell phone companies where there's hidden fees that can occur, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was going to be that much this month. The housing market, one of the many good things that came from it is that it prevented a similar fate of those surprise balloon payments. So you know exactly what your monthly mortgage payment is going to be. It's simple and it's a very transparent way to pay off the debt without fear also of rising costs like rent would be. Finally, having equity, and this is probably, other than the health reason, right, not being in a group home and having control over what kind of services you let in, other than the health reason, this last one is probably the other big reason, is that you will build in equity, okay? Having equity can be used to take out a personal loan for any type of emergency, whether it's medical expenses or not, okay? And, having a personal loan is while it's still a loan, obviously it's not free money, but it is a lot cheaper than running on credit card bills or maxing them out. So those are the reasons why I really, when you're talking about, employment, there's a lot of talk about, under the ADA and having people with disabilities employed, and it's always focused on, kind of the income level, right? Raising the glass ceiling. And I totally applaud for that. But I also think that be cautious of how quickly you rise. You may be very mindful of the fact that you might lose any of those social benefits that you have, but you may also not realize that, hey, I may also miss out on an opportunity to get some assistance to at least buy the home, right? And I was facing that situation myself. So as I discussed in the book, I became a federal employee, and I was looking for a house, and it took me a while. And in the interim, I knew that there was a home ownership program for people with disability in the state of Maryland. I was lucky. Maryland actually has a separate program. that's separate from HUD and everything like that. But there was an income cap, right? And so I was up for a promotion, and I literally had just submitted in a contract, and I had said, listen, you know what, I want to use this program. This program only requires $500 down payment. I can loop in all my costs. I need to get this program. So I had to pass up the promotion. And that was a bitter pill. It was. Because potentially I could make, an extra $10,000 over the whole next of the year. But I knew that having a house was a better investment economically for me over the long run than that $10,000. And I was right. Because when I bought the house in the recession, it's been 8 years, and I have, about $100,000 in equity in the home. So it was the right decision. It was hard. And I just kind of relayed that to everyone that, when you're going to ADA events and you're talking about employment and raising the glass ceiling, that may be true. But when it comes to housing, please look into that far away. You don't miss any of those opportunities that you might have gotten if you're low income. Sometimes you just have to baby step a few things. In conclusion of today's podcast, I want to remind everyone listening that it takes a village to make a change. Nothing can live just within ourselves or with other similar like-minded individuals. So please, this month and any month, showcase how important the ADA is to the disability communities and others through the hashtag called #Thanks to the ADA, or participate in many of the virtual events this month, such as #Picture Possibilities, that relates to videos of everyday people with disabilities overcoming challenges. If you have an ADA celebration event this month, please put it on the website devoted to the ADA celebrations every year at www.adata.org, which stands for ADA National Network. During this month, I also invite you to join my Facebook page, Accessibility is Home, to ask your questions about real estate and independent living concerns, or, better yet, just share your success stories there. And please use the hashtag #HomesForDisabled on all your social media networks. Don't forget to join my Instagram and Twitter accounts, which are at DoorMyBlue, which is short for the title of my book on Amazon called My Blue Front Door. Of course, if you want more information outside of this podcast, check out my blog at http://myfrontdoorsite.blog, and also found on my book's website at www.angelafoxbooks.com. So thank you very much for listening to AI Podcast Day, because accessibility is home.